Hi, I'm glad you're back. Today we're going to be looking at the book of Revelation, the second session that we've done, studying chapters 2 and 3 on the seven churches listed in the book of Revelation. Again, this video is not intended to replace attendance at the class, nor is it intended to replace the homework. It's merely a supplement to help those who are not able to attend all the time, or for those who are looking for a recap going into the next week's session. So we looked at the seven churches to whom John addresses his letter, his revelation to, his apocalypse, you might say. And we talked about how it's very important that we spend time studying these seven churches because it helps us to remember that this revelation was intended for a certain audience, for a certain group of time. Oftentimes people go and deal with the seven visions and the rest of the book, but they're not paying any attention to the intended audience. And that actually gives us a really solid footing for how to read this. So it's a good thing that we are doing some exegetical work, digging into whom these first century Christians were and what their churches were like. We talked about why it was addressed to these seven churches in Asia Minor. We certainly know that there were other churches, congregations, groups of Christians in Asia Minor at that time. It might be simply for the fact that they were along a trade route that a postal carrier, a courier would have carried these letters to. We talked about the fact also that these groups of Christians, these cities would have been well known in the area. So anyone who was reading the letter would be able to understand exactly whom the audience is. We also discussed the fact that it's important that these seven, this was never intended to be separated for any of the churches. There's a lot of connection between the seven churches, and so we talked about how that's important, that they were never intended to be read separately, but they were always intended to stay together in the form that we see them in today. And the most notably is at the end of each closing where it says, "He who has ears, let him hear." We see that even though it's addressed, say, to the church at Ephesus or at Philadelphia, but if you have ears to hear, if you have an open heart to hear what John is saying through this, what Jesus Christ is saying through this revelation through John, then it is intended for you. Look through the notes, and there are a lot of excellent information as to what it was like during those times. I also have a slideshow that I'll put online next to this with some pictures to give you a glimpse into what remains of some of these places. But the real key of what we had to discuss was dealing with the three main issues that each of these churches were dealing with. If you could take what's addressed to each of the seven churches, you'd find three common themes. The first theme was the theme of persecution. And so we did some exploration into the emperor of the time, Emperor Domitian, and learned that while an early Roman historian talked about him being so vain and a megalomaniac who became paranoid towards the end of his reign. Modern historians have done research, and they don't see that times during Domitian's reign were any more terrifying than normal, that anyone in Asia Minor was even affected. And we even looked at the gate at Laodicea, which was constructed during the Emperor Domitian's reign. And there is a phrase on the gate at Laodicea praising the emperor, but not calling him Lord and God. There is this rumor made by the ancient Roman historian in your notes that said that he wanted to be called Lord and God, that he also believed he was the Apollo incarnate, making him the son of Zeus, and therefore a god in his lifetime. But modern historians don't see any proof of that. So that led us to realizing that persecution of the early Christians wasn't actually coming from the top down. It wasn't necessarily that the Roman Emperor Domitian was gathering up all these Christians and sending them away to see who's faithful and who's not faithful. What was actually happening was that their neighbors, if you made someone angry or they didn't like you for some reason, they could very easily send you to the Roman authorities for being suspect, and cause havoc on your life that way. So that led us to our second issue. First being persecution, the second one being assimilation. And the assimilation, if you are we talked about how they might be invited to a big community-wide festival, and the eating at the festival for, say, Artemis, that was seen as worship of Artemis. So if you were an early Christian and you didn't believe in Artemis and you didn't want to worship Artemis, how were you to act? Because all of these 7 churches, these 7 groups of folks, were very heavily connected in the trade community. And so they really relied on each other. They really relied on their neighbors. So I'd like you, if you weren't there, to take a moment and kind of think about what that would be like if you were a minority. Living in America right now, the majority, we have the majority faith of Christianity. So what would that be like to be in the minority, but yet to be dependent on your neighbors? And so we talked about how the early Christians were dealing not only with persecution, but they were also dealing with the issue of assimilation. Thirdly, we looked at how the early Christians, that led them down the path of complacency, really. And that's also the note of John's letters to these churches, is that they're dealing with complacency because they're not sticking to their convictions. So there's some really good notes in your book on that. I do want to keep these videos short, so I'm not going to go into that much more. I encourage you to read the notes. There's some really interesting facts about these 7 churches. Look at the pictures. It kind of helps to bring it to life. And I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that you are able to take a moment and reflect on how you might be in your life dealing with either persecution or assimilation or complacency. Because we closed with discussing how, even though this letter was addressed to a very specific group of people, these are 3 topics that are very relevant for us today, and probably for Christians and people of all faiths around the world. So we are to, pay mind to the warnings through the letters to these 7 churches. I look forward to seeing you. We meet on Thursdays from 10 to 12 in the parish hall, and all are welcome. Have a blessed day.